The dull hum of the spaceship's engines filled the air as it hurtled through the black void of space. On board, a group of alien recruits sat awkwardly in a sterile, metallic room that passed for a training bay. The beings were an eclectic mix: tall, gangly insectoids with chittering mandibles, small, round creatures that looked like sentient marshmallows, and even a gaseous life form suspended in a shimmering containment sphere. The room was alive with the sounds of nervous chatter, clicks, and the occasional squelch of an unknown appendage adjusting its posture. In the center of the room stood Lieutenant Jordan Grant, a human in her mid-30s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She adjusted her cap, the emblem of the United Galactic Coalition glinting in the artificial light. Her fatigues were immaculate, her boots polished to a mirror shine. She looked out at the recruits and smirked. "All right, listen up," she said, her voice cutting through the cacophony like a laser. "You're here because someone in the coalition decided you're worth training. Over the next 90 days, we're going to see if that's true." One of the recruits, a gangly creature with limbs too long for its body, raised a hand. "Excuse me, Lieutenant, but we've already undergone extensive training on our homeworlds." "Surely." Jordan cut him off with a sharp glare. "You've been trained on how to fight your own wars, using your own species' tactics. But this isn't about your world. This is about the galaxy. And let me tell you something, the galaxy doesn't care about your traditions." The room fell silent. Jordan paced in front of them, her boots clicking against the metal floor. "The coalition is under threat," she continued. "The Zorvax Empire isn't just expanding, it's obliterating. Entire planets, wiped out. And if you want to survive, if you want your species to survive, you're going to learn from us." A squat, beetle-like alien clicked its mandibles. "Humans? What could we possibly learn from you?" Jordan's smirk widened into a grin. "Everything." The recruits quickly learned that human training was nothing like the regimented drills and simulations they were used to. On the first day, they were taken to a combat simulation chamber, a massive, holographic environment capable of replicating any terrain. It was a marvel of technology, but that wasn't what unnerved them. What unnerved them was the wild, unpredictable chaos Jordan unleashed within it. The recruits found themselves dropped into what looked like an urban battlefield. The sky was dark, lit only by the occasional flash of distant explosions. Buildings crumbled around them, and the air was filled with the sounds of gunfire and screams. The scenario was meant to simulate an invasion by Zorvax forces, but Jordan had added a twist. "What is this madness?" shouted Zrix, the gangly alien who had spoken up earlier. He ducked as a holographic car exploded nearby, sending simulated debris flying. "Keep moving." Jordan's voice crackled over their comms. "You're not here to think. You're here to act." One of the recruits, a squat, jelly-like creature named Ploof, tried to roll behind cover but found itself stuck in a pile of digital rubble. "This isn't fair," it wailed, its voice a high-pitched squeak. "We weren't prepared for this." "That's the point," Jordan barked. "The Zorvax won't wait for you to be prepared. They'll hit you when you least expect it." A tall insectoid named QYL, whose carapace gleamed under the dim light, hissed in frustration. "There is no strategy here. No order. This is chaos." Jordan's voice was almost gleeful. "Exactly." By the end of the day, the recruits were battered and exhausted, their egos bruised even more than their simulated wounds. They gathered in the mess hall, a low murmur of complaints and confusion filling the air. "I don't see the point of this," Zrix said, folding his gangly arms. "Humans are too chaotic. They don't follow proper combat doctrine. They're unpredictable," Ploof said, wobbling slightly. "It's unsettling." QYL tapped one of its claws against the table. "Unsettling or not, there is something effective about their methods. We survived today because we adapted." The room fell silent as the recruits mulled over QYL's words. Adaptation was not a concept they were unfamiliar with, but the way humans employed it was unlike anything they had encountered. It wasn't just about changing tactics, it was about embracing the chaos, thriving in it. Over the next few weeks, the recruits were pushed to their limits. Jordan introduced them to the art of improvisation, teaching them how to use their environments to their advantage. They learned to expect the unexpected, to exploit weaknesses in ways that defied conventional strategy. One day, Jordan led them into a simulated jungle, where they were tasked with defending a base from an approaching Zorvax force. The recruits immediately began fortifying their position, setting up barricades and deploying what little equipment they had been given. Jordan watched them with a critical eye. "Not bad," she said. "But you're forgetting something." "What?" Srix asked, his voice tinged with irritation. Jordan pointed to the dense foliage surrounding them. "The jungle. Use it." The recruits exchanged confused glances. "The jungle is not a weapon," QYL said. "It's just terrain." Jordan grinned. "That's where you're wrong." She demonstrated how to set traps using vines and branches, how to camouflage themselves with mud and leaves, and how to create distractions using the sounds of the jungle. The recruits were hesitant at first, but as they began to experiment, they realized the effectiveness of these unconventional tactics. By the time the Zorvax force arrived, the recruits were no longer huddled behind their barricades. They were hidden in the trees, their traps and distractions, turning the jungle into a death trap for the invaders. When the simulation ended, the recruits gathered around Jordan, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. "You see," she said. "War isn't just about firepower. It's about ingenuity. Creativity. You don't fight the enemy's war. You make them fight yours." For the first time, the recruits didn't argue. As the weeks turned into months, the recruits began to change. Their initial skepticism gave way to respect, and eventually, admiration. They no longer saw human tactics as chaotic and unpredictable. They saw them as adaptable and effective. But the real test came on the final day of training. The recruits were gathered in the simulation chamber, their gear freshly polished, their expressions grim. Jordan stood before them, her eyes scanning their faces. "This is it," she said. "Your last mission. You're going to face a full-scale Zorvax assault. No safety nets. No do-overs. This time, it's real." The recruits exchanged nervous glances but said nothing. They had come a long way, and they knew it. Now, it was time to prove it. The simulation began, and the recruits were thrown into a chaotic battlefield. Zorvax ships descended from the sky, their weapons lighting up the landscape. The recruits moved with precision, their movements fluid and coordinated. They set traps, used the terrain to their advantage, and adapted to every challenge the simulation threw at them. When it was over, the recruits stood in the smoking ruins of the battlefield, their simulated enemies defeated. Jordan approached them, a rare smile on her face. "Congratulations," she said. "You're ready." For the first time, the recruits felt something they hadn't in a long time: hope. In just 90 days, they had been transformed into a force the galaxy had never seen before. And they owed it all to the chaos and creativity of human training. The first rays of simulated sunlight pierced the jungle canopy in the combat training zone. The recruits were already on their feet, weary but focused, their bodies sore from endless drills. Lieutenant Jordan Grant stood at the edge of the clearing, hands on her hips, her sharp gaze scanning the motley crew. "You've survived your first month," she said, her voice cutting through the heavy air. "Congratulations. That means you're smart enough to adapt but not yet good enough to thrive. The next phase will separate the survivors from the warriors." Srix, the gangly alien with a penchant for complaints, muttered, "What more could they possibly throw at us?" Jordan heard him and smirked. "Oh, you'll find out." With a sharp whistle, she motioned for the recruits to gather. A holographic projection materialized in the air above her, depicting a Zorvax assault force descending on a heavily fortified city. "This is Jarrell Station," Jordan explained. "One of the Coalition's most vital supply hubs. If it falls, the Zorvax will gain a foothold in the sector. Your mission: defend the station. You have 2 hours to prepare. Go." The recruits exchanged nervous glances. 2 hours was barely enough time to scout, let alone fortify. But they had learned not to question Jordan's timelines. They scattered into the simulated city, splitting into teams to assess the terrain and available resources. Zrix found himself paired with Ploof, the jelly-like alien whose awkward waddling had become a point of humor among the group. "Great," Zrix muttered. "I'm stuck with the blob." Ploof wobbled indignantly. "I may not be fast, but I'm clever. You'll see." The two made their way through a crumbling marketplace, where remnants of food stalls and debris offered little in terms of cover. Zrix kicked at a broken crate. "There's nothing here we can use." "Not true," Ploof said, pointing at a stack of rusted metal rods. "With a little creativity, those could be spikes to slow down ground troops." Zrix hesitated. "Spikes? Against Zorvak's tanks?" "Not the tanks," Ploof said, his gelatinous form jiggling as he rolled toward the pile. "But the infantry? Spikes might funnel them into a kill zone." Reluctantly, Zrix helped Ploof drag the rods into position. As they worked, Zrix couldn't help but notice how Ploof's unorthodox ideas were starting to make sense. The jelly might not have been fast, but it thought fast. Elsewhere, QIL led a team of insectoid recruits to a towering skyscraper overlooking the central plaza. Its exoskeletal fingers tapped against a holographic map. "The high ground is critical. We can use this building to provide overwatch." One of the recruits, a spherical creature covered in shimmering scales, protested. "But it's too exposed. If the Zorvaks spot us, we'll be sitting targets." "Then we won't let them spot us," QAL replied, his mandibles clicking. He motioned to another recruit. "Gather every piece of debris you can find. We'll camouflage the windows and set up sniper nests." The team went to work, their movements precise and efficient. Under QAL's leadership, they transformed the crumbling skyscraper into a hidden fortress. For the first time, the recruits began to see the value in using the environment to their advantage. Meanwhile, Jordan observed the chaos from a command console. Her second-in-command, Sergeant Ortega, leaned over her shoulder. "You think they're ready for this?" Jordan shrugged. "Not yet. But they will be." Ortega raised an eyebrow. "What's the catch?" Jordan's grin was wolfish. "You'll see." The assault began at sunset. The simulated Zorvax forces arrived in waves, their sleek, angular ships descending with an ominous hum. Ground troops poured into the city, their glowing red visors cutting through the darkness like malevolent eyes. The recruits sprang into action. Zrix and Ploof's makeshift spike traps worked better than expected, funneling enemy infantry into narrow alleys where the recruits' firepower overwhelmed them. QIL's sniper team rained down precision shots from the skyscraper, picking off key targets with chilling efficiency. But the Zorvaks were relentless. For every wave the recruits repelled, another arrived, stronger and more coordinated. The recruits' lines began to falter, and panic set in. "This isn't working," Zrix shouted into his comms. "We can't hold them off forever." "You don't have to hold them forever," Jordan's voice crackled in response. "Just long enough." "Long enough for what?" QIL demanded. As if on cue, the city's automated defense systems roared to life. Turrets rose from hidden compartments, spewing energy bolts that decimated the Zorvax forces. The recruits watched in stunned silence as the tide of battle turned. "You see?" Jordan said, stepping into view as the simulation ended. "You don't always have to win the fight. Sometimes, you just have to buy time." The recruits regrouped in the mess hall, their bodies aching but their spirits buoyed by their success. For the first time, they felt like a team. "This human strategy," QAL said, his tone thoughtful. "It's effective." "It's messy," Zrix added. "But I'll admit, it works." Ploof wobbled with pride. "See? I told you creativity was important." Jordan entered the room, her presence commanding immediate attention. "You did well today," she said. "But don't let it go to your heads. The Zorvaks won't always make mistakes. The next time, they'll adapt. So the question is, can you adapt faster?" The recruits nodded, their faces grim but determined. Jordan's expression softened slightly. Good. Because the real fight is coming sooner than you think. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of increasingly difficult scenarios. Jordan threw everything she could at the recruits: urban warfare, jungle ambushes, zero-gravity combat. Each simulation pushed them to their limits, forcing them to think faster and work smarter. One particularly grueling scenario placed the recruits on a barren moon, where they had to navigate a maze of canyons while avoiding Zorvax patrols. The lack of cover and the constant threat of detection tested their patience and ingenuity. Plouffe, surprisingly, excelled in the environment. Its gelatinous form allowed it to squeeze into crevices too small for the others, scouting ahead and marking safe paths. "You're like a slippery little spy," Zrix said, grudgingly impressed. "Adapt or perish," Plouffe replied cheerfully. QIL, meanwhile, used his keen eyesight and natural climbing abilities to scale canyon walls, providing overwatch and relaying enemy movements to the team below. By the end of the exercise, the recruits had not only survived but outmaneuvered their simulated enemies. Jordan watched from the command console, a rare smile playing at her lips. "They're getting it," Ortega said. Jordan nodded. "They're not just surviving anymore. They're thriving." One evening, after a particularly grueling day, the recruits gathered around a makeshift fire pit in the recreation area. For the first time, they began to talk not just as comrades but as friends. "I used to think humans were reckless," Zrix admitted. "But now I see, you're just willing to take risks we wouldn't." "Calculated risks," QIL corrected. "And it's why their tactics work." Plouffe jiggled happily. "And they've taught us how to think like them." Jordan watched from a distance, her arms crossed over her chest. She didn't say anything, but a small part of her swelled with pride. The recruits weren't just learning human tactics, they were embodying them. And she knew, in her gut, that they would need every ounce of that ingenuity in the battles to come. The hum of the transport ship's engines was the only sound as the recruits sat in tense silence. This was no longer a simulation. For the past week, the Coalition's command network had been filled with frantic reports of Zorvax incursions across multiple systems. The enemy wasn't just expanding, it was preparing for a decisive strike. Now, the recruits, freshly trained and untested in real combat, were heading into the heart of the conflict. Lieutenant Jordan Grant stood at the front of the cabin, her posture steady despite the tremor of the ship beneath her boots. The recruits looked to her, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. "This is it," Jordan began, her voice steady and commanding. "You've spent the last 90 days learning how to fight like humans. And let me tell you, it's not just about brute force or fancy tech. It's about adapting, improvising, and surviving. You've proven you can do that in training. Now it's time to prove it for real." Zrix raised a spindly hand. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, what exactly are we walking into?" Jordan gestured to the holographic map that flickered to life in the center of the room. It displayed a massive orbital station surrounded by swirling debris and smaller Zorvax ships. "This is Outpost Arcadia," Jordan explained. "It's a critical refueling station for the Coalition fleet. If the Zorvax take it, they'll cripple our supply lines, and this sector will fall within days." Plouffe wobbled nervously. "So, we're the reinforcements?" Jordan shook her head, her smirk faintly amused. "You're the first wave." The recruits exchanged uneasy glances. Even QIL, who had become one of the group's most confident leaders, hesitated. "Our objective," Jordan continued, "is to neutralize the Zorvax ground forces and secure the outpost's defense systems. Once we've done that, the Coalition fleet will arrive to finish the job." "Questions?" Zrix raised his hand again. "And if we fail?" Jordan's smirk faded, replaced by a steely resolve. "Then we die trying. Because if we don't, everyone else will." The transport shuddered as it broke through the station's defensive perimeter. The recruits strapped into their seats, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. Explosions rattled the hull as enemy fire grazed the ship. "Brace for landing," the pilot shouted. The ship hit the station's docking bay with a jarring thud, and the ramp dropped open. Jordan was the first out, her weapon raised as she scanned the chaotic scene. The docking bay was a war zone, with coalition forces exchanging fire with Zorvax soldiers. "Move, move, move," Jordan shouted, waving the recruits forward. The recruits spilled out of the transport, their training kicking in as they took cover behind crates and debris. Zrix fired his plasma rifle with surprising accuracy, taking down a Zorvax soldier that had flanked their position. Plouf used its gelatinous body to shield a wounded coalition trooper, absorbing incoming fire while QYL and the others provided cover. Jordan was everywhere at once, shouting orders, coordinating movements, and taking down enemies with brutal efficiency. The recruits followed her lead, their initial fear giving way to a fierce determination. "This is it," Zrix muttered to himself as he reloaded. "Adapt or perish." The battle raged for hours as the recruits pushed deeper into the station. The Zorvax were relentless, their advanced weaponry and sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm the outpost's defenders. But the recruits had learned to thrive in chaos, and their unconventional tactics began to turn the tide. In one corridor, Plouf used its unique physiology to slip through a narrow ventilation shaft, emerging behind enemy lines to disable a critical power relay. In another, QYL led a team of recruits in an ambush, using the station's layout to funnel Zorvax forces into a kill zone. Zrix, despite his earlier doubts, had become an effective combatant, his long limbs allowing him to handle weapons with surprising agility. He took down an enemy sniper with a perfectly aimed shot, earning a nod of approval from Jordan. "You're finally getting it," she said as she passed him, her tone both encouraging and firm. "Now keep it up." But the Zorvax weren't done. As the recruits reached the station's central command hub, the ground trembled beneath their feet. A low, mechanical hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. "What now?" Plouf squeaked, its gelatinous form quivering. The answer came in the form of a towering Zorvax mech, its angular frame bristling with weapons. The recruits froze as the machine's glowing red eyes scanned the room, its cannons charging with a menacing hum. "Fall back," QAL shouted, his voice cutting through the panic. The recruits scrambled for cover as the mech opened fire, its energy blasts reducing entire sections of the command hub to molten slag. Jordan dove behind a console, her mind racing. "This wasn't in the mission brief," Zrix muttered, his voice shaking. Jordan glared at him. "Mission briefs don't mean squat when the Zorvax are involved. We improvise." "Plouf, can you distract it?" Plouf blinked, or at least, its gelatinous equivalent of a blink. "Distract it? How?" "Figure it out." Jordan snapped, already moving to flank the mech. Plouf hesitated for a moment before wobbling out into the open, its quivering form bouncing erratically. The mech's sensors locked onto it, and it unleashed a torrent of fire. While Plouf darted and dodged, Zrix and QYL worked together to rig an improvised explosive using a damaged power cell. With the mech distracted, they managed to plant the device on one of its legs. "Fire in the hole," Zrix shouted, diving for cover. The explosion rocked the mech, sending it crashing to the ground in a shower of sparks. The recruits cheered, their victory short-lived as more Zorvax soldiers poured into the room. "We're not done yet," Jordan shouted, rallying the recruits. The battle reached its climax as the recruits fought to secure the station's defense systems. Every corridor, every room was a battlefield, and the recruits had to rely on every ounce of their training to survive. QYL and Zrix worked together to activate the station's automated turrets, turning the tide against the Zorvax forces. Plouf, despite its small size, became an unlikely hero, using its unique abilities to sabotage enemy equipment and shield its comrades. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the station's alarms blared with a new tone. The coalition fleet had arrived, their ships unleashing a devastating barrage that sent the remaining Zorvax forces into retreat. The recruits slumped against the walls of the command hub, their bodies battered but alive. Jordan entered the room, her expression one of rare pride. "You did it," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You proved that you're not just recruits anymore. You're warriors." The recruits exchanged tired smiles, their camaraderie forged in the crucible of battle. "And you'd better get used to it," Jordan added, her smirk returning. Because this was just the beginning. The smell of scorched metal and ozone hung heavy in the air as the recruits gathered in the aftermath of the battle. Outpost Arcadia, once a hub of coalition activity, now resembled a smoldering ruin. Yet amidst the wreckage stood the recruits, battered, bruised, but victorious. The Zorvax had retreated, and the coalition fleet had secured the area. Lieutenant Jordan Grant walked among them, her gaze sweeping over the group. They looked exhausted, but their eyes gleamed with a newfound resolve. She couldn't help but smirk. They had come a long way from the skeptical, bickering rookies she'd met 3 months ago. "Not bad," Jordan said, her voice carrying across the docking bay. "Not bad at all. But don't start celebrating just yet. The Zorvax don't take kindly to being outmaneuvered. They'll be back." QIL, his exoskeleton scuffed and cracked, stepped forward. "Let them come. They'll find us ready." Jordan's smirk widened. "That's the spirit." The aftermath of the battle was a blur of activity. Coalition engineers began repairing the station's defenses, while medics tended to the injured. The recruits, now treated as equals by the veteran soldiers, worked tirelessly to assist. Plouffe was stationed in the infirmary, its gelatinous body forming makeshift splints for injured troops. Zrix helped organize supply crates, his long limbs surprisingly efficient at stacking. QAL coordinated with coalition officers, his natural leadership abilities shining through. Jordan observed them from a distance, pride swelling in her chest. But she knew the battle was far from over. The Zorvax weren't the type to retreat quietly. They were already planning their next move, and the recruits would have to be ready. 2 days later, the warning came. The coalition command network crackled to life with an urgent transmission. A Zorvax fleet had been spotted on the edge of the system, and they weren't alone. Multiple signatures indicated the arrival of a new weapon, something massive. In the command center, Jordan and the recruits listened to the grim report. A holographic projection displayed the approaching fleet, with a massive, ominous silhouette at its center. "What is that?" Plouffe asked, its voice trembling. Jordan's jaw tightened. "A Zorvax dreadnought. Their flagship." Zrix's eyes widened. "And it's coming here?" "Not just here," Jordan said. "They're planning to make Arcadia an example. If they take this station, the coalition will lose morale, and the war." QIL stepped forward, his mandibles clicking. "Then we can't let that happen." Jordan nodded. "Exactly. We're not just defending Arcadia. We're defending the coalition." The coalition fleet scrambled to prepare for the dreadnought's arrival. Ships moved into position, their weapons charged and ready. On the station, the recruits worked with the veterans to fortify defenses and strategize. Jordan gathered them in the central command room, her expression grim but determined. "This will be the toughest fight you've ever faced," she said. "The dreadnought is bigger, stronger, and better equipped than anything we've dealt with before. But it's not invincible." She pointed to the holographic projection, highlighting a weak point near the dreadnought's engines. "If we can get a strike team on board and disable their propulsion systems, we can cripple the ship and force the fleet to retreat." Zrix raised a hand. "And I'm guessing we're the strike team?" Jordan grinned. "You catch on fast." The strike team boarded a captured Zorvax shuttle, its retrofitted cloaking device keeping it hidden from the enemy fleet. The recruits sat in silence, their weapons at the ready. The hum of the engines was the only sound as they approached the dreadnought. "This is it," Jordan said, her voice steady. "Once we're on board, it's all or nothing. Stick to the plan, cover each other, and don't stop moving." The recruits nodded, their nerves replaced by a quiet determination. They were ready. The shuttle docked with the dreadnought, its hull sealing against the massive ship's exterior. Jordan led the way, her weapon raised as the airlock hissed open. The interior of the dreadnought was a maze of corridors and chambers, its walls glowing with an eerie red light. The recruits moved in formation, their training kicking in as they navigated the hostile environment. Zorvak's soldiers appeared at every turn, their weapons blazing. But the recruits fought back with precision and ingenuity. Zrix used his long limbs to disarm enemies, while QYL coordinated ambushes to outflank them. Ploof, despite its small size, proved invaluable, slipping through narrow vents to disable key systems. Jordan led them to the engine room, where the ship's massive propulsion core thrummed with energy. The room was heavily guarded, and the recruits took cover as a firefight erupted. "We need to plant the charges." Jordan shouted over the din. "Ploof, can you get close?" Ploof wobbled nervously but nodded. "I'll try." The gelatinous recruit slipped past the chaos, its flexible body allowing it to evade enemy fire. It reached the core and began planting the explosive charges. "Cover Ploof," QAL shouted, firing at an approaching Zorvak squad. The recruits rallied, their combined firepower holding the enemy at bay. Ploof finished setting the charges and wobbled back to safety. "Detonation in 60 seconds. Jordan announced. "Move." The team retreated through the corridors, the sound of the charges ticking down behind them. Zorvak's soldiers pursued them relentlessly, but the recruits fought with everything they had, their training and camaraderie guiding them. As they reached the shuttle, the charges detonated. A massive explosion rocked the dreadnought, sending shockwaves through the ship. Alarms blared as the propulsion systems failed, and the ship began to list. The recruits boarded the shuttle, and Jordan slammed the controls. "Punch it." The shuttle shot out of the dreadnought just as another explosion tore through its hull. The recruits watched from the viewport as the massive ship erupted in flames, its debris scattering across the void. The Zorvak's fleet, seeing their flagship destroyed, began to retreat. Back on Arcadia, the recruits were hailed as heroes. Coalition officers praised their bravery, and veteran soldiers nodded in respect as they passed. In the mess hall, the recruits sat together, their bond stronger than ever. Zrix raised a glass. "To human training," he said, a rare grin spreading across his face. "To chaos," QAL added, clicking his mandibles. "To adaptation." Ploof squeaked, wobbling with excitement. Jordan entered the room, her expression uncharacteristically soft. "To survival," she said, raising her own glass. "You've earned it." The recruits cheered, their voices echoing through the station. They had come together as strangers, trained under the harshest conditions, and emerged as a force to be reckoned with. The galaxy had underestimated them, but it wouldn't make that mistake again. And as the coalition began to push back against the Zorvaks, one thing became clear: the galaxy's deadliest force wasn't advanced technology or sheer numbers. It was adaptability, creativity, and the unyielding determination of those who had trained to embody the chaos of humanity.